The wind came down off the ridge like something with teeth, and Della Talbot leaned into it, one gloved hand fisted in her mare's mane, the other pressed against her hat to keep it from sailing into the white dark. She had left the Ortega Rancho at midday with clear sky at her back, and a signed translation of a water rights agreement folded inside her coat. And now, 3 hours later, the sky had turned on her the way California skies sometimes did in the high country come late October, without patience or warning. She almost missed the wagon. It sat canted in a ditch beside the toll road, one wheel half swallowed by drifting snow, the horses in its traces stamping and blowing steam, their eyes rolling white at the edges. A man lay sprawled in the snow beside the front wheel, face down, one arm flung out as if he had been reaching for something when he fell. Della was off her horse before she had finished deciding to be. "Sir." She turned him by the shoulder, expecting warmth, expecting breath, and found neither at first, only the slack weight of him and snow already gathering in the creases of his coat. She pressed 2 fingers beneath his jaw the way her mother had taught her, searching, and for one long, terrible moment felt nothing at all. "He's not yours." A man's voice called through the wind, and she looked up to see another rider coming hard down the grade, a big bay horse laboring through the drifts, its rider bareheaded, his hat lost somewhere behind him in the storm. "I only just found him," Della called back. "There's a woman in the wagon, I think, and the horses need tending before they bolt or freeze standing." The stranger swung down without answering, and there was no wasted motion in him, no hesitation, the kind of economy of movement Della associated with men who had spent years doing hard things quickly. He went to the horses first, murmuring low words she could not hear over the wind, and got a hand on the near one's cheek strap, and the animal quieted almost at once, as if some old habit in it recognized a competent hand. "Silas Easton," he said, when he came back around the wagon, crouching across from her over the fallen man. "I was riding for Larkspur Crossing when I saw the wagon go off the road. Is he breathing?" "I cannot find a pulse," Della said, and heard her own voice come out steadier than she felt. "Help me turn him fully. If there's snow packed in his mouth, he may only look gone." Together they rolled him onto his back, and Silas Easton bent his ear low to the man's lips, and the moment stretched long enough that Della had already begun composing, in some cold, practical corner of her mind, what she would need to do next, how she would get a laboring woman off this mountain with a dead man for a husband and a storm closing the only road. Then the man's chest heaved and he coughed, a wet, ragged sound, and his eyes came open, wild and unseeing at first, fixed on some middle distance neither of them occupied. "Vance," he said, the words scraping out of him like it cost him blood to say it. He knew. God help us. He knew the water was bad and he sold us his tonic anyway and told Ruth it would cure the fever. He knew. "Sir, you're safe. You're on the toll road. We've got you," Della said, catching his hand, trying to anchor him back into his body, but his eyes had already rolled and his head lolled sideways, and he was gone again into whatever dark water had nearly claimed him for good. "Who is Vance?" Silas asked, and something in his voice had gone very quiet and very careful, the voice of a man filing a name away somewhere it would not be lost. "I don't know," Della said, "but there is a woman in that wagon who may know, and unless I am mistaken, she is about to have a baby in the middle of a blizzard, so whoever Vance is, he will have to wait." As if summoned by the words, a cry rose from inside the wagon, high and frightened, cut through by pain, and Della was moving before the sound had finished, hauling herself up over the tailboard into the close canvas dark, where a young woman lay half buried in quilts, her face white as the snow outside, her hands gripping her swollen belly. "My husband," the woman gasped. "Amos, where is Amos? Is he? He's breathing. My name is Della Talbot, I'm a midwife, and I need you to tell me how long you've been feeling pains." "Since before dark," the woman said, and her voice cracked on the last word, the fear in it plain. He said we had to keep moving. He said if we didn't reach the crossing before the storm shut the pass, we'd be stranded. And then he just fell, right off the seat like something had struck him down, and I couldn't stop the team. I couldn't. You're stopped now, Della said, gentling her tone the way she had learned to over years of rooms just like this one. Rooms full of fear that needed somewhere to go besides the mother's blood. What's your name? Ruth. Ruth Carney. Ruth, I need you to breathe with me, and I need to see how far along you are. And outside that canvas there is a man who is going to build us a fire and get your husband warm, because that is what he is good for right now, and I am going to be good for you. Can you do that with me? Ruth Carney nodded, tears freezing at the corners of her eyes, and gripped Della's offered hand hard enough to bruise. Outside, Della heard Silas already at work, the ring of a hatchet against dead pine, low words to the horses, the particular unhurried competence of a man who had decided what needed doing and meant to do it without complaint. She found she was glad of the sound. It gave her one less thing to hold in her mind while she worked. The examination told her what she feared. The baby was already turning, already low, and there would be no reaching a doctor, no reaching so much as a proper roof before it came. She had delivered babies in worse places than a wagon bed, she told herself, though in the moment she could not honestly recall one, and she set her jaw and reached for the leather satchel she carried everywhere, the one that held her scissors and her clean linen and the small bottle of laudanum she used so sparingly, and began to work. "Mr. Easton," she called out, pitching her voice to carry over the wind. "I am going to need snow melted for hot water, and I am going to need more light than the lantern in here can give, and I am going to need you not to faint if you come near enough to help." There was a short pause, and then, through the canvas flap, a voice that held the ghost of a laugh in it despite everything. "I was a lawman 11 years, Miss Talbot. I have seen worse than childbed, though I confess I have not delivered a baby before tonight." "Neither have I delivered one in a blizzard," Della said, "so we shall discover our talents together." He built the fire close against the wagon's lee side, sheltered from the worst of the wind by the bulk of the vehicle, and a lean-to of pine boughs he cut with quick, sure strokes, and he heated snow in a battered coffee pot he found lashed to the wagon's side, and he brought her water hot enough to steam in the freezing air, and he held the lantern where she told him to hold it, high and steady, his jaw tight with concentration. Never once looking away, though Della guessed from the color that rose and fell in his face that he was not so unmoved as he pretended. Amos Carney, half-conscious and shivering by the fire where Silas had dragged him and wrapped him in every blanket the wagon held, muttered names into the smoke, Vance's chief among them, and once, clearly enough that both of them heard it, the phrase, "the well behind the mercantile." I told him it tasted of iron and worse." "He is not raving without reason," Silas said quietly to Della, in the brief lull between one of Ruth's pains and the next. "I know that mercantile. I know the man he means." "Then you will tell me the whole of it," Della said, not looking up from her work. "Once this child is safely born, and not one moment before. I cannot hold two crises at once, Mr. Easton, even for you." "Fair enough," he said, and something in the way he said it, some note of respect rather than offense, settled a small warm place in her chest that she did not have time to examine. The birth, when it came hard and fast, the way second stage sometimes did after a long, slow start, and Della talked Ruth through it in a low, steady stream of instruction and encouragement, and Silas held the lantern, and when Della barked at him to support Ruth's shoulders so the young woman would not slide backward into the wagon bed, did that too without flinching, his big hands surprisingly gentle. The baby came into the world in the worst blizzard Della had seen in 3 years of riding this circuit, squalling before she was even fully free, a furious red-faced girl with a shock of dark hair, and Della caught her, cleared her mouth, and felt the old familiar rush of relief and awe that she had never once in all her years of this work managed to make ordinary. "A girl," she said, and heard her own voice thick with something that was not only exhaustion. "Ruth, you have a daughter." Ruth wept and reached for the baby, and outside the canvas Della heard Silas Easton let out a breath like a man who had been holding it for the better part of an hour, and then, absurdly, softly, he laughed, a single startled sound of pure relief. "Well," he said, "I did not faint." "No," Della agreed, wrapping the baby in the cleanest linen she had and laying her against her mother's chest. "You did not. I will remember that in your favor, Mr. Easton, should you ever need me to." They got Amos, Ruth, and the newborn into the shelter of an abandoned trapper's line shack half a mile down the grade before the worst of the storm broke fully over the mountain. Silas carrying Amos across his shoulders like a sack of grain, while Della led the wagon team by their bridles through drifts that came near to her knees. And by the time the wind finally screamed itself hoarse sometime past midnight, all four of them, 5 counting the baby, were huddled around a fire inside 4 solid walls, alive. And that, Della thought, watching Silas Easton feed another split log into the flames with the careful economy of a man used to making fuel last, was no small thing to have accomplished. Together on a night that had tried twice to kill them. Amos Carney did not die that night, though it was a near thing, and it took 2 full days holed up in the line shack, feeding him broth and willow bark tea, and once, when the fever spiked dangerous and high, a dose of Della's precious quinine, before his eyes cleared enough to hold a conversation that made sense. "You spoke of a man named Vance," Della said, on the second morning, when the wind had finally dropped and pale sun lay thin and cold across the drifted snow outside the shack's one window. "You said he knew the water was bad." Amos was propped against a folded saddle blanket, gaunt and hollow-eyed but lucid now, and Ruth sat beside him with the baby at her breast, and he looked at Della for a long moment before he answered, as if weighing how much of himself to give away to a stranger. "Harlan Vance," he said finally, "owns the mercantile at Larkspur Crossing, owns the only well within 3 miles that hasn't gone dry this season, or so he tells folks. We stopped there 10 days back to buy winter supplies before the passes closed. Ruth and I both took sick within 2 days of drinking from that well. He sold me a tonic, told me it was quinine cut with good spring water, told me it would see off the fever. It didn't. It only seemed to make me worse and weaker and slower in my thinking until I could hardly hold the reins." "Did you tell anyone else in town you were ill?" Silas asked, from where he sat cleaning his revolver at the small table, a task Della had noticed he performed with the same unhurried thoroughness he brought to everything else. "Told the fellow who runs the livery," Amos said. "He said half the camp had had the same trouble this season. Said Vance blamed it on bad meat, on folks not boiling their water proper, on anything but his own well. There's an old Indian man, name of 2 Rivers, been telling anyone who'd listen for a month that the water back of the mercantile tasted of the old mining cuts upstream, said his people wouldn't touch it. Vance had him run off the street for it, called it disturbing the peace." Silas's hands went still on the revolver. "I know that," he said quietly. "I was the one ordered to arrest him." Della looked up sharply. "And did you?" "No," Silas said. "That is why I no longer carry a badge, Miss Talbot. I resigned it 2 months back. On the very afternoon the mayor and Harlan Vance between them told me to jail an old man for the crime of telling the truth about a well that was making children sick. I told them I would not do it, and I gave up the Tin Star, and I have been hauling freight and breaking horses since, because it turns out a man can live without a badge a good deal easier than he can live without his own conscience." The line shack was quiet a moment, only the fire popping and the baby making small contented sounds against her mother's breast. "Then you and I," Della said slowly, "may have more use for each other than I first supposed, Mr. Easton. I translate for the Rancho families and for 2 Rivers' people both, when there is business to be done between them and the town. If what Amos says is true, and Vance has known his well was fouled and sold poor medicine to cover the harm of it, that is not only a wrong against these 2. That is a wrong that will touch every family in Larkspur Crossing before this winter is through. I mean to see it stopped," Silas said, and there was nothing dramatic in the way he said it, no swagger, only a flat certainty that Della found she believed entirely. "Then we had best get this family down off the mountain," she said, "before we decide how." They reached Larkspur Crossing 2 days later, the wagon repaired, the road passable if slow, the Carney family wrapped in every blanket they owned, and the baby, whom Ruth had already taken to calling her little blizzard child, sleeping soundly against her mother's chest, as though the storm of her birth had spent all the world's trouble at once and left none over for her. Larkspur Crossing was not a large town, a scattering of clapboard and canvas buildings strung along the toll road where it crossed the creek on a wooden bridge, with a scarred hillside above it still showing the raw wounds of placer mining from years past, and a scattering of tents and cabins climbing the far slope, where the last of the independent miners still worked their claims. There was a livery, a blacksmith, 2 saloons, a small Methodist chapel that also served as a schoolhouse 3 days a week, and Vance's Mercantile, the largest building in town, its false front freshly painted, its windows bright with goods laid out to entice men flush with the last of the season's gold before the roads closed for winter. Della had been to Larkspur Crossing perhaps a dozen times over the past 3 years, always on business, translating land claims for Don Rafael Ortega's Rancho family when their boundaries brushed against Anglo settlers, or standing between the town council and Two Rivers' people when some dispute over grazing or water needed careful words on both sides to keep it from becoming something worse. She knew the town's temper the way she knew the temper of a nervous horse, and she did not like what she felt in it now, a kind of brittle haste, everyone hurrying to finish business before the first real snow shut the high road for good, everyone's nerves worn thin by the season. She saw Harlan Vance for the first time standing in the doorway of his Mercantile as their small procession came down the main street, a well-fed man in a good coat, silver at his temples, a smile ready on his face for anyone who might be a paying customer. His eyes went to the Carney wagon, to Amos slumped pale and thin against the seat, and something flickered behind the smile, gone so quickly Della might have imagined it, had she not spent years learning to read faces for the truth beneath the words. "Mr. Carney," Vance called out, coming down his steps with his hand already extended. "I heard there was trouble on the road. Terrible storm, that one, caught half a dozen wagons unaware. Glad to see you made it through." "No thanks to your tonic," Amos said, his voice weak but clear enough to carry. Vance's smile did not waver, though his eyes flicked to Sela's, and something passed between the two men that Della could not read but did not like. "Well now," Vance said easily, "fever makes a man say all manner of things he doesn't mean. You get some rest, Mr. Carney, and we'll talk about accounts when you're feeling more yourself." "We'll talk about the well," Silas said, swinging down from his horse, and his voice had none of the easy drawl Vance used, only a flat quiet that carried further for its lack of heat. "Same as we discussed 2 months back, Harlan, except this time I expect you'll find fewer folks willing to look the other way." Vance's gaze moved from Silas to Della, taking her in, the dust of the road on her coat, the leather satchel of her trade slung across her shoulder, and something in his expression sharpened, recalculated. "Miss Talbot," he said, with a small courteous nod that did not reach his eyes, "I did not realize you kept such company these days." "I keep the company the day requires, Mr. Vance," Della said. "Today it requires a doctor, which this town does not have, and so it will have to make do with a midwife, a healer, and whatever plain truth we can gather about your well before another family is poisoned by it." The street had gone quiet around them, the kind of quiet that meant people were listening even while pretending not to, and Della saw Vance register this too, saw him decide, with the quickness of a practiced man, that a public quarrel served him worse than a private one. "I am sure," he said, "that whatever concerns you have, we can discuss them like reasonable people indoors over coffee, rather than airing a sick man's fevered dreams in the street where they might frighten folk needlessly before winter." "We will discuss them," Della said, Once Mr. Carney is settled and his wife and daughter are warm and fed. But I promise you, Mr. Vance, they will be discussed." Vance's smile thinned, but he only inclined his head and turned back toward his store, and Della watched him go with the uneasy sense that she had just declared a war she did not yet fully understand the shape of. They found lodging for the Carney family with the widow Perch, who kept a boarding house at the edge of town and had, Della knew, no love for Harlan Vance since a dispute 2 summers back over flour weights. And while Ruth and the baby rested, Della and Silas walked together toward the creek that ran behind the mercantile, where the town's well sat inside a small stone housing not 50 yards from the water. "Show me," Della said, and Silas led her to it without hesitation, clearly a route he had walked before. The well itself looked ordinary enough, a stone ring, a windlass, a bucket hanging idle on its rope, but when Della leaned close and drew up a bucketful and held it to the weak autumn light, she could see, faint but unmistakable, an oily sheen across the water's surface, and when she touched a finger to it and brought it near her tongue, the bitter metallic taste that followed made her recoil. "Iron," she said, "and something else besides. This has been fouled a long while, Mr. Easton, longer than one bad season." "There was an Asher through here in the spring," Silas said. "Man named Ezra Combs came up from Placerville testing claims for a mining concern. Vance paid him to test the well water too, quiet-like, after 2 children took sick that summer. I know because I was still wearing the badge then, and Combs came to me first before he went to Vance, said the water showed signs of runoff from the old hydraulic cuts upstream, said it wasn't fit to drink without boiling a good long while, maybe not fit even then." "And what did Vance do with that report?" "Buried it," Silas said, his jaw tight. "Told Combs it would ruin half the town's confidence right before winter, when folks most needed to trust the water they'd be drinking for months shut in by snow. Told him there was no other well within 5 miles besides his own private spring behind the store, which he charges dear for, and that if the town well went bad in the general opinion, he stood to make a great deal more money selling hauled water at a premium than he'd lose from a little bad publicity. Combs took his payment and rode on to San Francisco, far as I know, and never spoke of it again, at least not where I could hear." "Then we need Combs's report, or Combs himself," Della said, "or some other proof besides an old Indian man's word and a sick man's fever accusations, because I promise you, Mr. Easton, a man like Vance will make both of those very easy for this town to dismiss." "I know it," Silas said. "It's why I couldn't make the charge stick when I still had the badge to do it with. My word against his, and mine already suspect for having quarreled with him over 2 rivers before that. But you, Miss Talbot, you have something I never did." "And what is that?" "You have the trust of every side in this valley at once," Silas said. "The Rancho families trust you because your mother was one of their own. The Nicemen trust you because you have never once, in 3 years I've heard tell of, translated a word false to serve your own convenience. And the town trusts you because you have caught half their babies and set half their bones and never asked more than a fair fee for it. If you stand up and say this well is fouled and Vance has known it, folks will listen to you in a way they never listened to me." Della considered this, the cold creek water still on her fingertips, the shape of the fight ahead of her settling into focus. "Then I had better be very sure of my facts," she said, "before I say a word of it aloud." They found 2 rivers 2 mornings later, in the small cluster of cedar bark houses and canvas tents that stood along the creek a mile above town, where his people had lived since long before any Anglo miner had ever set a pan in the American river's gravel, and where they had watched, in the space of a few short years, their salmon runs choke with silt, and their oak groves fall to the axe, and their water turn the color of rust in places it had once run clear. 2 Rivers was an old man, his hair gone iron gray, his hands scarred from a lifetime of work, and he received Della with the easy warmth of long acquaintance, though his eyes went carefully to Silas before he spoke. "This is the man who would not arrest me," he said in Nicenan, and Della translated it without needing to be asked, watching Silas's face as the words landed. "I remember," Silas answered, and Della rendered it back. "I remember exactly why I would not." "Then he is welcome at my fire," Two Rivers said, "though I do not forget that other men wearing his old badge might not have been so particular." They sat together while Della carefully, patiently, drew from Two Rivers everything he knew of the well, of the old hydraulic mining cuts upstream that had been abandoned 3 years back when the Easy Gold ran out, of the way the water below those cuts had run strange and bitter ever since, worse in dry years when there was less clean flow to dilute it. He had told the town council this himself more than once and been laughed at, and finally, when he grew insistent, arrested for it, though the charge had been dropped for lack of any real crime once Silas refused to pursue it, and the mayor found no other willing hand. "There is more," Two Rivers said, and here he paused, weighing something before he continued. "The asser who came in spring, the one Vance paid to test the water, he spoke with me also before he left. He was troubled by what Vance asked him to do. He gave me this and told me to keep it safe in case a day came when it was needed." He rose and went into his house and came back with a folded paper, worn soft at its creases from handling, and passed it to Della. She unfolded it carefully and read, and felt something cold and certain settle in her chest as she did. It was Ezra Combs's original report in his own hand, plainly stating that the town well at Larkspur Crossing showed contamination consistent with runoff from the abandoned hydraulic diggings above the creek, that the water was unsafe for consumption without extended boiling, and that he recommended the well be closed and an alternative source developed before the onset of winter, when boiling water for an entire town became a far heavier burden. At the bottom, in the same hand but different ink, as though added later under duress, was a second line, paid in full by H. Vance to withhold public notice pending further review. "He signed his own guilt," Silas said softly, reading over Della's shoulder, and she could hear something fierce and glad rising under the quiet of his voice. "Fool must have thought no one would ever see this but Vance himself. Or he did not want to carry the lie alone," Della said. "Some men cannot do wrong without leaving some small mark of their conscience behind, even against their own interest." "This is enough," Silas said. "This and Amos Carney's testimony and Two Rivers' word, and the water itself, if we can get someone with authority to test it fresh. This is enough to end him, Della." It was the first time he had used her given name, and she noticed it the way one notices a change in weather, a small shift that nonetheless altered everything around it, and she found she did not mind it at all. "Then let us not waste the advantage," she said, and rose, tucking the precious paper inside her coat where the cold could not reach it, close against her heart where she would feel it if it were somehow lost. But Harlan Vance, it turned out, had not survived and prospered through 3 lean gold rush years by being slow to sense danger, and by the time Della and Silas returned to town that afternoon to call a meeting of the Citizens' Council, word had already reached him, carried by some frightened or well-paid tongue, that a paper existed which could ruin him. He came to find them himself, at the Widow Perch's boarding house, his easy smile entirely gone now, replaced by something harder and more calculating. "I hear you've been up visiting the Indian camp," he said to Della, standing in the doorway with 2 of his hired men behind him, big rough fellows who did the mercantile's heavy freighting and, Della suspected, whatever rougher business Vance required besides. "I hear tell you've got some paper you think proves a story about my well." "I have a paper that proves you knew the water was fouled and sold sick men false medicine rather than lose custom to a fresh well," Della said, standing her ground though her heart hammered. "I mean to bring it before the council tomorrow evening." "That would be a mistake," Vance said, "for you and for this town. Winter's near on us, Miss Talbot. This is the last week wagons will make it over the pass before the snow shuts it for good. Half of Larkspur Crossing has not yet finished laying in flour and salt pork and medicine enough to see their families through to March, and every ounce of it comes through my store, because I am the one man in this valley with the credit and the connections to bring goods up from Sacramento before the roads close. You destroy my name tomorrow night, and you may find this town starving by January, whatever satisfaction it gives you to see me ruined. It was, Della thought, a genuinely frightening threat, made worse for being at least partly true, and she saw Silas's jaw tighten beside her as he weighed the same terrible arithmetic. Then perhaps, Silas said slowly, we ought to have thought of a fresh supplier before now, Harlan, instead of letting one man hold a whole town's winter hostage to his own guilty conscience. Perhaps you ought, Vance agreed pleasantly, though I don't see how you'll manage it with 3 days left before the pass shuts. Bring your paper to the council if you like. I'll simply remind everyone what becomes of families who cannot buy flour. He left them with that, and Della stood in the cold doorway a long while after he had gone, watching her own breath cloud in the darkening air, feeling the weight of the choice bearing down on her. He means it, she said finally. He would truly let children go hungry to save his own name. I believe he would, Silas said, which is why we cannot simply expose him and hope the town manages the winter on nothing. We need another way to bring goods through, or convince a second merchant to open credit to families Vance would otherwise starve out. There is a freight company out of Coloma, Della said slowly, working it through. Ortega Rancho trades with them for supplies they cannot grow themselves. If I asked Don Rafael, and he agreed to vouch for the town's credit through the winter, we might break Vance's monopoly before we ever need to break his reputation. Then we had better ride to Coloma tonight, Silas said, storm season or no, because 3 days is not a great deal of time to save a town from its own grocer. They rode through the night to the Ortega Rancho, an hour's hard travel along the dark creek road, and Della roused Don Rafael from his bed with an urgency that brooked no ceremony, and laid the whole matter before him in the rapid, precise Spanish she had spoken since childhood, watching the old rancher's face darken with anger as he understood the shape of Vance's crime. This man has poisoned children to protect his profits, Don Rafael said, and threatened to starve a town rather than answer for it. Yes, Della, I will vouch for Larkspur Crossing's credit at Coloma. I will send my own vaqueros to escort the freight wagons through, if the weather allows it. But you must understand, this will make Vance a dangerous enemy. A cornered man is not always a peaceful one. I understand it, Della said, and I will not ask Silas Easton to carry that danger alone, nor will I stand aside from it myself. It was my hand that caught Ruth Carney's daughter in that storm, Don Rafael. I do not intend to let the child grow up in a town poisoned for one man's profit. Don Rafael studied her a long moment, something like pride softening the anger in his weathered face. Your mother would be glad to hear you say so, he said. Go with God, both of you, and ride carefully. The mountain roads are treacherous enough without a man like Vance also wishing you harm. They rode back toward Larkspur Crossing as the first gray light of dawn touched the ridgeline, exhausted, cold, but carrying with them Don Rafael's written pledge of credit and the promise of freight wagons within days. And Della found herself, in the tired quiet of that ride, more aware than she had any business being of the man riding beside her, of the steady way he sat his horse even after a night without sleep, of the careful attention he paid to the road ahead and to her own tiring pace, slowing without comment whenever her mare began to lag. You did not have to come with me tonight, she said, somewhere in the last mile, when the silence between them had grown comfortable enough to break without spoiling it. I did, though, Silas said. I have watched this town suffer under Harlan Vance's thumb for 3 years, Della, and done precious little about it besides resign a badge and ride off angry. Tonight is the first night since then that I've felt like a man doing something worth the doing, instead of just a man who quit. You did not just quit, she said. You refused to do a wrong thing, which is harder than most men manage in my experience. I have translated for enough land disputes to know how few men choose the difficult right over the easy wrong when their own comfort is on the line. Maybe, Silas said, "but it is easier to refuse a wrong than to build a right in its place. I am glad of your company in the building of it, Della Talbot, more than I quite know how to say." She looked over at him then, at the tired, honest lines of his face in the growing light, and felt something settle in her chest that she had not felt in a great while, not since before her mother's death, not since she had built her whole life around being useful to everyone and belonging fully to no one, always the translator, always standing between, never quite inside any circle she served. "I am glad of yours as well," she said, and meant it more than the plain words could carry. The council meeting, when it came 2 evenings later, was a tense, crowded affair in the chapel that served the town for its school and its worship both, every bench full, lantern light throwing long shadows against the rough plank walls, and Harlan Vance sat in the front row with his 2 hired men flanking him like a man who expected trouble and meant to be ready for it. Della stood before the town with Ezra Combs's report in her hand and told them, plainly and without embellishment, what the water had done to Amos Carney, what it had likely done to half a dozen other families that fall who had blamed their fevers on bad meat or ill luck, and what Harlan Vance had known and hidden to protect his profits. She spoke first in English for the settlers, and then, because 2 Rivers had come to stand quietly at the back of the chapel with several of his people, she repeated the substance of it in Nicenan as well, so that no one in the room, whatever tongue they had been raised in, could claim afterward they had not understood. Vance rose to defend himself, smooth and reasonable as ever, calling the report a forgery, calling Amos Carney's testimony fever madness, calling Della herself an outsider meddling in town business that was not properly hers to meddle in. But Silas stood then, and spoke plainly of the day 2 months back when Vance and the mayor had ordered him to jail 2 Rivers for the crime of warning his neighbors, and of his own refusal, and the town, which had wondered quietly for 2 months why their steady, well-liked marshal had suddenly resigned, murmured with the particular weight of people realizing they had misjudged a wrong for a very long time. And then Don Raphael's letter was read aloud, pledging fresh credit and freight from Coloma within the week, and the last of Vance's leverage, the threat of a hungry winter, crumbled visibly on his face as the town realized it no longer needed to choose between truth and survival. It was not a clean victory, not without cost. Vance did not simply confess and repent. He blustered and threatened lawsuits, and for one ugly moment seemed near to violence before his own hired men, sensing the wind had turned against their employer, quietly slipped out the chapel door rather than be caught standing beside a ruined man. But by the time the meeting ended, the council had voted to close the fouled well permanently, to dig a new one above the old hydraulic cuts where 2 Rivers himself showed them clean water still ran, and to strip Vance of his position as the town's sole approved supplier, opening the door for Don Raphael's freight arrangement, and for a young clerk named Ferris, who had worked under Vance for 2 years and hated him for it, to open a rival store with what savings he had. It should have ended there, Della thought later, with Vance humiliated but not destroyed, forced to compete honestly or leave, the town's water made safe again before the deep snows came. It should have ended there, and for 3 quiet days it seemed as though it would. But Harlan Vance, stripped of his monopoly and his good name in the same evening, was not a man built for quiet defeat. The fire started 2 nights after the council meeting, in the small hours before dawn, in a barn at the edge of town, where the widow Perch had, at Della's urging, gathered the families still recovering from that autumn's fever, along with several crates of the town's dwindling medical supplies, moved there for safekeeping, once the old mercantile storeroom came under suspicion. Amos and Ruth Carney were there, and 3 other families besides, sleeping in makeshift beds among the hay, and it was the smell of smoke, not any sound, that woke Della, who had stayed the night herself to check on a child running a lingering fever. She came awake choking, the barn already thick with gray haze, orange light licking up through gaps in the loft floor where the fire had caught in stored hay. And she was on her feet and shouting before she had finished understanding what was happening, hauling children up from their pallets, pushing them toward the door. Outside, the night sky had a strange wrongness to it, the wind that had been merely brisk all evening now gusting hard and dry out of the northeast, the kind of offshore wind that could turn a small fire into a disaster within minutes. And Della saw with horror that the flames had already leapt from the barn to the dry grass beyond it, running fast along the hillside toward the very cluster of tents and cabins where Two Rivers' people slept. Silas was there almost as quickly as she was, having been roused by the smell of smoke from where he had been sleeping in the livery loft, and together they worked with a speed born of pure necessity, dragging families from the burning barn, calming the terrified horses that screamed and reared against their picket lines, shouting instructions that cut through the panic. "The creek," Silas bellowed over the roar of the growing fire. "Everyone to the creek now. The water will hold the fire's edge if we can get across before it jumps the road." Della caught Ruth Carney's arm, the baby wrapped tight against her chest, and half carried, half dragged her toward the horses, while Silas worked the picket line loose, freeing frightened animals that bolted in every direction the moment the ropes fell away, forcing him to catch and calm them one by one, murmuring the same low, steady words that had gentled the Carneys' team that first night in the blizzard. The fire, driven by the strange, dry wind, moved with a speed that defied belief, racing up the grassy slope toward the Nicenan camp faster than any person could outrun it on foot. And Della's stomach dropped as she realized Two Rivers' people had not yet been warned, that the wind was carrying flame toward them, even as the town below scrambled merely to save itself. "Silas, the camp," she shouted, and he understood at once, swinging up onto the nearest horse he had managed to catch and reaching down a hand for her. "Come on," he said. "You know their tongue and I know these hills better than the fire does. We go together or not at all." She took his hand and swung up behind him, and they rode hard along the creek road toward the camp, the fire's glow lighting the underside of the smoke-thick sky like a second false dawn, and reached the cedar-bark houses just as the first embers, carried on the wind, began to fall among the dry brush at the camp's edge. Della's warning cry in Nicenan brought people boiling out of their homes in seconds, and there was a terrible chaotic scramble of grabbing children, driving horses, snatching up what could be carried. And it was in the middle of that scramble that the real danger nearly turned to tragedy of a different kind. A knot of frightened Anglo miners, fleeing the fire from the town side, came pounding up the same road on foot and horseback, and seeing the Nicenan camp already alight with movement and shouting. One of them, wild-eyed with panic and half convinced by rumors Vance himself had spread in better days about Indian raids and stolen cattle, raised his voice in an accusation that could have turned disaster into bloodshed in an instant. "They said it," the man shouted, pointing wildly at the fleeing families. "The Indians set the fire to drive us off. I heard it from Vance himself. They've been threatening it for weeks." The words rippled through the frightened crowd like a spark finding new fuel, hands going to belts where pistols hung, voices rising in ugly agreement. And Della felt the night tilt toward a violence that would kill people just as surely as any flame, and she did the only thing she could think to do. She put herself between the two groups, raised her voice to its full carrying pitch, and spoke, first in English, then instantly in Nicenan, translating each side's words to the other with a speed and precision that left no room for rumor to fill the gaps. "This fire started in the Widow Perch's barn in town, where the sick families were sheltered, not here," she shouted. "I was there. I smelled the smoke before it ever reached this hillside. These people are running for their lives exactly as you are, and if you raise a weapon against them tonight over a lie Harlan Vance planted in your ear to save his own skin, you will have to answer to me and to Silas Easton both, and to God besides, for whatever blood follows." Silas moved his horse forward, into the space between the two frightened crowds, his voice carrying the flat, unshakable authority of a man the town had trusted with a badge for 11 years even now that he wore none. "She's right," he said. "I rode this road myself not 20 minutes past, and I saw the fire catch in that barn from a spark, not from any hand of these people. We have maybe 10 minutes before this whole hillside is aflame behind us. We can spend it fighting each other, or we can spend it saving every soul on this road, Indian and settler both, and sort out lies afterward when we are all still breathing to do it." The moment held, terrible and uncertain, and then slowly the man who had shouted the accusation lowered his hand from his belt, shame beginning to war with fear on his soot-streaked face, and the ugly murmur of the crowd shifted, redirected, toward flight instead of fight. "To the creek crossing," Silas shouted again, and this time both groups moved together, a ragged, desperate column of settlers and Nicenan families, horses and wagons and children carried on hips, streaming down toward the wide, shallow ford where the creek widened below the town, the one place Della knew the fire's edge could not easily cross. The next quarter hour passed in a blur of smoke and heat, and shouting that Della would never afterward be able to fully separate into distinct memories, only fragments. Silas riding back twice into the smoke to drag out families who had hesitated too long gathering possessions. The terrible bawling scream of a horse whose mane had caught a stray ember, and the swift, sure way Silas got a blanket over its head and led it, blind and trusting, down to the water. Ruth Carney wading into the creek up to her waist with her daughter held high above the current, Amos, still weak but upright, at her side. Two rivers standing chest-deep in the ford, passing children hand to hand across the current to safety on the far bank, and Della herself, soot-blackened and hoarse, moving back and forth along the water's edge, counting heads in two languages, refusing to believe the crossing complete until every single soul she could account for stood dripping and shivering but alive on the safe side of the creek. The fire raged through the night, consuming the barn entirely, scorching a wide black scar up the hillside where Two Rivers' camp had stood, taking with it 3 cabins at the edge of town, and Della would learn only the next day. Harlan Vance's own mercantile, caught by a wind-driven ember that leapt clean across the toll road and found dry tinder in his storeroom, an irony so complete that half the town would speak of it for years afterward as a kind of frontier justice, though no one, not even Della, could say for certain whether the fire had begun by Vance's own hand, meant to destroy the evidence against him and burn out the witnesses who had spoken against him, or by simple terrible accident born of dry wind and careless embers in a season already primed for disaster. What was certain, when dawn broke gray and smoke hazed over the ruin, was that no one had died. Every family from the widow Perch's barn stood accounted for on the far bank of the creek. Two Rivers' people, though they had lost tents and stores and the season's dried salmon, had lost no lives. And Harlan Vance himself was found by the town's newly appointed constable 2 days later, boarding a stage bound for Sacramento with as much cash and as many portable goods as he could carry, fleeing not the fire, which had ruined him financially as thoroughly as the council's vote had ruined him socially, but the growing certainty among the townsfolk that arson, not accident, had cost them their barn and nearly cost lives on that terrible windy night. He did not return, and no one in Larkspur Crossing much mourned his absence. In the days after the fire, exhausted, grieving small losses and grateful for the great one that had been spared, the town of Larkspur Crossing did what frontier towns did. It began, almost immediately, to rebuild. Della found herself in those days, working alongside Silas Easton with a constancy that felt less like circumstance and more, with each passing week, like choice. They helped Two Rivers' people rebuild their scorched shelters before the first true snow. They oversaw the digging of the new well, sited exactly where the old man had said clean water ran, and watched with quiet satisfaction as it came up sweet and clear from the first bucket. They wrote together, a full account of Vance's fraud and the fire's likely cause, to be lodged with the county authorities in Placerville, so that if he ever surfaced again to trouble another town, some record would exist to meet him. And in the small, quiet hours between all that necessary work, they talked, the way people talk who have already survived a blizzard and a fire together and found, in each survival, some new reason to trust the other's hand. "You could go anywhere," Silas said to her one evening in November, the two of them sitting on the Widow Perch's porch steps with mugs of coffee cooling in their hands, the rebuilt barn's raw new timber pale against the burned hillside beyond it. "You've told me yourself. You've translated from Monterey to the Feather River. You belong to every community and none of them, always moving on when the business is done. What is it that would make a woman like you stay in a town like this, once the pass is clear come spring and the roads open again?" Della considered the question a long moment, turning her coffee mug slowly in her hands, feeling the honest weight of it. "I have spent my whole life being useful to people without quite belonging to any of them," she said finally. "My mother's people never fully claimed me because my father was an Anglo trader. The settlers trust my translation but rarely invite me to their hearths as kin. Even the Nicemen, who have been kinder to me than most, know I will always ride on eventually, because that is what I do. I have told myself for years that this suited me fine, that I preferred to belong everywhere a little rather than anywhere entirely." "And do you still tell yourself that?" Silas asked, watching her with a quiet steadiness that made it difficult to look away. "I delivered a stranger's child in a blizzard 3 weeks ago," Della said, "beside a man I had never met before that night, and in the time since, I have found myself less interested in riding on than I have been in a very long while. I think, Silas Easton, that you may be the first reason I have ever had to consider staying somewhere simply because I wished to, rather than because business required it." "I resigned a badge rather than do a wrong thing," Silas said, "and I have spent 2 months since wondering what I resigned it for, if not simply to prove I could. I think I know the answer now. I think it was so that, when a woman like you rode into my life in the middle of a snowstorm, I would still have a clean enough conscience left to be worthy of standing beside her." He reached over then and took her hand, careful and unhurried, the same way he had held the lantern steady on the worst night either of them had lived through, and Della let him, and found that the winter cold seemed a good deal less sharp with his fingers wrapped around hers. Winter settled properly over Larkspur Crossing not long after, the passes closing as they did every year, the town drawing inward around its rebuilt hearths and its new clean well. And Della, who had always spent winters wherever her last translation work happened to end, found herself, almost without deciding it in any single dramatic moment, still there in December, still there through the deep quiet cold of January, helping deliver 2 more babies, setting a broken arm, translating a dispute over grazing rights between Don Rafael's vaqueros and a group of newly arrived settlers before it could sour into anything worse, and in every spare hour the winter allowed, spending time with Silas Easton that neither of them any longer pretended was purely practical. He courted her the way he did everything, without haste but without hesitation either, small steady acts that added up, over the slow turning of that winter, into something neither of them needed to name aloud to understand fully. He mended the roof of the small cabin she had begun renting at the edge of town, though she had not asked him to and could easily have mended it herself. She sat up with him 3 nights running when a fever swept through the livery stables and threatened his best horses, and neither of them slept, and neither of them complained of the lost sleep afterward. He taught her, one bright cold February afternoon, to shoot a rifle with something better than the desperate inaccuracy she had managed all her life, standing close behind her to correct her stance, his hands warm over hers on the stock, and neither of them hurried that lesson along any faster than it needed to go. By the time the first hint of thaw came to the high passes in March, and word arrived that the toll road would reopen to wagon traffic within the month, Della Talbot had long since stopped thinking of Larkspur Crossing as merely her latest stop along a circuit that stretched from one end of the foothills to the other. She had begun, instead, to think of it as home, a word she had not applied to any single place since her mother's death, and she found she was no longer afraid of what the word might cost her in independence, because Silas Easton had never once, in all their months of growing closer, asked her to be smaller or quieter or less herself in order to be loved by him. If anything, she thought, watching him break a green colt in the corral behind the livery on a mild March morning, patient and firm and utterly unwilling to force what could be earned instead, he seemed to love her best exactly in the moments she was most fully, capably, unmistakably herself. The bridge across the creek, damaged the previous autumn by flood before ever the fire came, had been rebuilt over the winter with lumber the town could finally afford thanks to Don Raphael's honest credit and Ferris's new store. And the town council, in the flush of spring optimism that came with the passes clearing and the first wagon trains due within the fortnight, decided to mark its reopening, along with the reopening of the town's small new clinic. Built onto the Widow Perch's boarding house with Della as its resident midwife and healer, with a proper community celebration. The morning of the celebration dawned clear and mild, the kind of pale gold California spring morning that made even the fire-scarred hillside above town look almost gentle, new green already pushing up through the black. The whole town turned out, Anglo settlers and Californio vaqueros and Two Rivers' people all gathered together along the creek bank in a way that would have seemed impossible the previous autumn, drawn by the shared relief of a hard winter survived and a new season beginning. Della stood at the entrance of the new clinic, freshly whitewashed, a hand-lettered sign above the door reading simply Talbot Clinic in careful black paint, and watched the crowd gather for the bridge dedication with something like wonder at how much had changed in half a year. Ruth Carney found her first, the baby, now a fat, laughing 5-month-old with her mother's dark eyes, riding on Amos's hip, both of them looking healthier and steadier than Della had dared hope that terrible first night in the storm. "We named her Grace," Ruth said, as she had told Della weeks before, "but her middle name is Talbot, so she'll always carry a piece of the woman who brought her safe into the world. Amos and I both wanted you to know that before the ceremony starts." Della felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. "I am honored," she managed. "Truly, Ruth, I am." "You ought to be," Amos said, with the first easy grin Della had seen on his face since his recovery. "That's about the finest name we had to give." Two Rivers came to stand with them as well, along with several of his people, and he spoke to Della in his own tongue, thanking her not only for the fire, but for the accuracy of her words in every dispute she had carried between his people and the town over the years, words that had, more than once, kept a small disagreement from becoming a large tragedy. "A translator who bends the truth to please whoever pays her is worse than no translator at all," he said. "You have never once bent it, not for us, not for them. This town owes you more than it knows how to say aloud, and so I will say it plainly instead. You belong here now, Della Talbot, if you will have us." "I will," Della said, and found she meant it with her whole heart. The dedication ceremony itself was simple. The town's new mayor, a fair-minded former miner named Cobb who had replaced the man complicit with Vance, cutting a ribbon strung across the new bridge's near end while the crowd cheered. And then, because sound carried easily across the calm morning air, everyone heard clearly when Silas Easton, standing at the front of the crowd beside Della, cleared his throat and spoke up before the mayor could move on to his next remarks. "Mayor Cobb," Silas said, "if you don't mind, I believe I have a piece of business of my own to conduct, and I can think of no finer morning nor no finer crowd of witnesses to conduct it in front of." He turned to Della then, and the crowd, sensing something afoot, quieted with the particular hush of a town that dearly loved a good story and suspected it was about to witness the making of one. "Della Talbot," Silas said, and though his voice was steady, Della could see his hands were not quite so steady as he reached into his coat pocket. "I met you beside a man we both feared was dead, in the worst storm this valley has seen in years, and in every single day since, through fire and through frozen mountain roads, and through the long, slow work of putting a wrong town back together. You have shown me more courage and more plain good judgment than I have found in any person, man or woman, in all my years wearing a badge or since. I do not have a grand speech prepared, because I have found in my life that grand speeches are usually a poor substitute for plain, honest words, so here are mine. I love you. I have loved you, I think, since the moment you told me not to faint while you delivered a baby in a blizzard, and I would be glad, gladder than I know how to properly say, if you would agree to be my wife." He opened his hand to show a plain gold band, simple and unadorned, the kind a working man could afford and a practical woman would actually wear, and Della, looking at it, and at him, and at the whole gathered town that had somehow, over one hard winter, become her own, felt no hesitation at all. "Silas Easton," she said, her voice carrying clear and sure across the quiet crowd, "you built me a fire in a blizzard and held a lantern steady while I worked, and you rode into a burning night to save people who were not your own kin, and you have never once, in all our months together, asked me to be anything other than exactly what I am. I have spent my whole life belonging to everyone a little and no one entirely, and I find I am done with that particular kind of loneliness. Yes, I will marry you gladly, and I cannot think of a finer place to begin our life together than this one, standing on a rebuilt bridge, in front of the very people we saved together." The crowd erupted into cheering that startled the horses tethered nearby and brought Two Rivers' people ululating in their own joyful custom. And Ruth Carney was crying openly. And even the new mayor was grinning ear to ear as Silas slid the ring onto Della's finger and kissed her there in the bright spring sunlight, in full view of the whole grateful town. The creek running clean and clear beneath the new bridge, the bell tolling at the new clinic behind them, and the mountains above, finally free of their long winter snow, rising green and gold and endless into the wide California sky. They were married 3 weeks later, in the same chapel that had held the town's council meeting the night Harlan Vance's schemes finally came undone, Don Rafael Ortega himself giving Della away as though she were his own daughter, Two Rivers standing as an honored witness beside a circuit preacher who happened, by great good fortune, to be passing through on his spring rounds, and the whole town of Larkspur Crossing turning out afterward for a celebration on the creek bank that lasted well past sundown, with fiddle music and dancing, and more food than the town had seen since before the fever, and the fire had darkened the previous autumn. Della Talbot did not stop her translation work, not for marriage, not for anything. She rode out still, whenever the rancho families or Two Rivers' people or the growing town needed her steady, accurate words to stand between them and misunderstanding. And Silas Easton, who had taken up work as the town's new constable at Mayor Cobb's earnest request, more often than not rode with her when the roads were rough or the business uncertain, the two of them a familiar sight along the foothill trails, trusted equally by every community the toll road connected. And in the evenings, when the day's work was done, they came home together to the small clinic house at the edge of Larkspur Crossing, where the sign above the door had been quietly repainted to read simply the Talbot Easton Clinic, and where, more often than either of them would have predicted on that terrible frozen night beside a stranger's wagon, laughter was the sound most often heard drifting out into the mild California evening. Ruth Carney's daughter, little Grace Talbot Carney, grew up strong and healthy through that spring and every spring after, the whole town's favorite proof that even the hardest beginnings could lead somewhere good. And every autumn, when the first cold winds came down off the high Sierra and folks in Larkspur Crossing began laying in their winter stores, someone would inevitably tell the story again, of the blizzard, and the wagon, and the midwife and the lawman who had met beside an apparently dead stranger and found, in saving him and his family together, the beginning of a love that had gone on to save the whole town besides. Della never tired of hearing it told, though she always insisted, with the same firm accuracy she brought to every translation, that the story properly credited Sela's Easton's steady hands as much as her own, and that neither of them had saved anything alone. It had taken both of them together, she said, every single time, the same way it always had, and the same way, she was quite certain, it always would.